Every reader leaves evidence behind. Not just the books we choose, but the way we read them, the sentences we underline, the margins we interrupt, the pages we fold, stain, or return to. Those marks are rarely intentional records. They're reactions made quickly, privately, without an audience in mind. And yet, taken together, they form something remarkably coherent. A map of attention, a record of belief, a trace of who we were when certain ideas demanded a response. This episode isn't about books as objects. It's about reading as an act of self-disclosure. Because sometimes the most honest version of us isn't what we say now, but in what we once marked and never meant anyone else to see. Welcome to Between the Covers with Danielle. This is the space where we slow reading down, not to summarize books, not to rank them, and certainly not to perform them, but to sit with what literature does to us over time, how it shapes our thinking, unsettles us, challenges us, and quietly keeps record of who we were when certain ideas mattered. Today's episode isn't about a single book. It's about what happens between the covers, in the margins, the underlines, the dog-eared pages we barely remember creating. We're talking about marginalia, the lost art of writing ourselves into the books we read, and what those marks reveal about our interior lives long after the moment has passed. So settle in, get comfy, and let's slip between the covers. We tend to talk about marginalia as a habit. Writing in books, underlining passages, folding corners, leaving coffee stains and fingerprints behind. But marginalia isn't a habit, it's a picture. It's what happens when reading stops being passive. When the reader refuses to simply absorb and instead begins to respond. The margin becomes a site of interruption, of disagreement, of urgency, a place where the text provokes something strong enough to leave a trace. Historically, marginalia wasn't seen as vandalism or distraction. It was evidence of engagement. Scholars argued in the margins. Theologians wrestled there. Readers left questions they didn't yet know how to answer. The margin wasn't supplementary, it was alive. And importantly, it was private. There was no expectation of polish, no audience, no future reader to impress, just thought happening in real time. That's what we've forgotten. If you line up the books you've annotated over the course of your life, something fascinating happens. You don't just see what you've read, you see how you were thinking. Early marginalia often has a particular tone. certainty, conviction, a hunger to underline what feels true. You circle statements that confirm who you believe yourself to be. You mark ideas that give language to emotions you haven't yet sorted out. There's often urgency in it, as if the act of underlining is saying, this matters, remember this is important. But if you compare that to Marginalia written years later, the texture changes. The notes soften, questions appear, sometimes silence. You don't underline as much, or you underline different things. Not declaration, but ambiguities. Not answers, but tensions. And sometimes the most striking thing is what you no longer mark at all. Ideas that once demanded a reaction now pass without resistance. That's not loss, that's evolution. Marginalia becomes a quiet psychological record, not of what you knew, but of what you needed at the time. And that's why revisiting annotated books can feel unsettling. You're not just rereading a text, you're encountering a former self who didn't yet know what you now know and didn't yet doubt what you now question. There's another layer here, what disappears. Not just the handwriting you no longer recognize, but the emotional charge behind it. Sometimes you read an old margin note and think, why did this matter so much to me? Other times you feel a pang because you no longer react with the same intensity. That can feel like growth, or it can feel like grief. Marginalia doesn't only record insight, it records attachment, what we fought for intellectually, what we resisted, what we clung to, and occasionally what we were afraid to let go of. That's why Marginalia is so honest. It captures thought before it's refined, emotion before it's edited, belief before it's defended. It doesn't show who we wanted to be. It shows who we were when no one was watching. Which brings us to the cultural shift. Because we don't really read like this anymore. Digital reading has made annotation more visible, but paradoxically less intimate. Highlights are neat, searchable, exportable. They're designed to be retrieved, shared, optimized. And social platforms have trained us to think of reading as something that produces content. Quotes, screenshots, aesthetic proof that we were there. But Marginalia was never meant to be seen. It was messy, contradictory, often wrong. It captured thinking before self-curation, before audience awareness, before the pressure to sound articulate or morally aligned or on the right side of things. Algorithms can tell us what we read. Marginalia tells us how we thought. And those aren't the same thing. In a culture obsessed with visibility, the margin offered privacy. In a culture obsessed with performance, it offered interiority. There's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, main character energy. Usually it means visibility, confidence, being watched. But I think we've misunderstood it. Real main character energy has very little to do with an audience. It's about having an interior life robust enough to hold contradiction. It's about thinking in ways that don't immediately translate into content. Marginalia is proof of that. It's evidence of a mind at work without applause, of engagement that didn't need validation, of thoughts that mattered, even if they never went anywhere else. In that sense, the margins are where the real narrative happens. Quietly, unseen, unperformed. So here's my invitation. Sometime this week, pull one old book off your shelf. Not your favorite, not the one you display, just one you've lived with. And instead of rereading the text, read the margins. Notice what you underlined, what you questioned, what you argued with, and ask yourself one thing. Who was I when this mattered to me? Not to judge that version of yourself, not to romanticize them, just to acknowledge them. Because in a world that's constantly asking us to document who we are now, there's something quietly powerful about letting the margins remind us that we've been becoming ourselves all along. And some of the most honest versions of us were never meant to be posted. They were meant to stay right there in the margins. If this episode stirred something, if it made you think differently about the books on your shelves or the versions of yourself quietly living inside them, I hope you'll sit with that for a moment. Because next time, we're widening the lens. Next week, we'll be talking about book banning, not as a headline, not as a culture war talking point, but as a question of power. Why certain books keep coming under fire, what they ask of us as readers, and what it says about a society when stories that invite complexity, empathy, and moral friction start to feel threatening. Between the covers is where some of our most honest thinking happens. Not for an audience, not for approval, just for ourselves.